For the last 40 years, Australia has consistently ranked among the richest countries in the world. Additionally, the nation has one of the best global reputations, seen as an idyllic paradise with gorgeous sandy beaches, beautiful cities, and incredible exotic wildlife. However, over the past decade, the island nation has experienced an economic decline. Apart from the pandemic turndown, 2023 marked the first time since 1991 that Australia entered a per capita recession, indicating a decline in each person's share of the nation's economic output. Combine this with skyrocketing inflation, slow wage growth, and astronomical housing costs, and you have a cost of living disaster, putting many Australians in the awful position of having to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table. Sydney, Australia's largest city, now has the dubious crown of being the second most unaffordable city in the world. Melbourne and Adelaide aren't far behind, coming in at 7th and 9th respectively. So how did this come to be? What went wrong that's making life in Australia impossible for the everyday citizen? On paper, the nation of Australia should be thriving. If one were to design an ideal nation, the priorities would be an abundance of energy, natural resources, arable farmland, a large territory suitable for expansion, geographical isolation from potential threats, and a well-educated and skilled populace. Australia possesses all of these in spades. The nation possesses huge reserves of iron ore, coal, natural gas, gold, zinc, copper, uranium, aluminum ore, and rare earth minerals. It's also one of the world's most food-secure nations, exporting more than 70% of its agricultural production. Australia, the sixth largest country in the world, spans 9.8 million square kilometers, and due to its isolated geography is well protected from foreign invasions. During World War II, Japan decided not to commit forces to the conquest of Australia due to the massive logistical problems it would create. And for much of the nation's history, these advantages were utilized successfully. Iron ore was in huge demand following World War II in rapidly industrializing nations like Japan, South Korea, and China. With Western Australia possessing the world's largest reserves in massive deposits in the Pilbara iron ore fields, mining and exporting began on a massive scale. Similar advancements were made in developing the coal and natural gas industries. This created thousands of jobs and led to the development of rail networks, ports, and manufacturing plants in the 1950s and 60s, marking the start of an economic boom and the transformation from an agrarian society to a modern industrialized one. The post-war boom period led to the creation of a thriving middle class and the construction of vast suburbs to house its young families. This also marked the formation of the Great Australian Dream, the belief that in Australia, home ownership leads to a better life through prosperity and security. While the American dream focuses on the opportunity for upward social mobility through hard work, the Australian dream focuses on home ownership specifically. This ideal led to a strong preference among Australians for suburban sprawl rather than urban densification, as well as a preference for real estate investment, but more on this later. Unfortunately, for the vast majority of young Australians, the Australian dream of home ownership is now out of reach for all but the highest income earners. Many are now faced with the prospect of being lifetime renters, and even this is becoming increasingly difficult as rental costs are skyrocketing in tandem. Australia's housing crisis is on the brink of catastrophe. While housing costs in major cities like Sydney and Melbourne have been high for decades, the pace at which home prices have increased since the COVID pandemic is astonishing. Since 2020, home prices around the country have increased by an eye-watering 39.9%, and in major cities like Perth, Brisbane, and Adelaide, the numbers are even higher, at 57.3%, 63.1%, and 64% respectively. These numbers are outrageous, but begin to make sense when you consider Australia's history of mismanaging its housing market. As mentioned previously, the nation is enormous and has plenty of potential land to build on. However, Australians have a strong preference for living in cities rather than rural areas, with 76% of the population residing in its 18 major cities. This preference for low-density suburban sprawl means Australian cities are far less dense than major metropolitan areas in other countries. To illustrate, Melbourne, measuring 9,993 square kilometers and with a population of 5 million, is actually larger than Mexico City, measuring 7,866 square kilometers with a population over 4 times greater at 21.8 million. Similarly, London, with double the population of Melbourne, is 3 times smaller. As a result, the demand for housing in major urban areas is sky high. To accommodate this, the obvious solution would be constructing higher density housing. However, municipal authorities have stubbornly resisted this, resulting in a massive supply and demand mismatch. Part of the reason for the government's refusal to construct high-density housing comes down to current homeowners. Many homeowners, while they might agree that more high-density housing should be built, don't want it built near them due to concerns about property value. Or, simply stated, build it, but not in my backyard. Couple the not in my backyard phenomenon with municipal approvals that move at a snail's pace, and you have new construction building rates consistently falling over the last decade. In 2023, only 170,000 new homes were built, the lowest figure in the last 11 years. Meanwhile, Australia continues to import huge numbers of immigrants each year, further increasing demand for the limited housing supply and driving up prices. Speaking of immigration, it's impossible to ignore the effect of migration on the economic crisis. The nation has one of the highest immigration rates in the industrialized world, with 740,000 new arrivals in 2022 alone. With an overall population of just 26.7 million, this represents a 2.77% increase in a single year. These figures are jarring and unsustainable for a nation already grappling with a severe housing crisis. There is a deeper issue here, however. Australia, like its northern cousin Canada, has fallen into a trap of its own making when it comes to immigration. Economic growth is being propped up by importing vast numbers of migrants to boost economies that largely revolve around real estate bubbles. In other words, while a certain level of skilled immigration is necessary for filling gaps in the labor market, importing huge numbers effectively doubles down on a real estate house of cards. Additionally, as new immigrants are more likely to be renters than owners, their impact on the housing market is primarily felt in the rental sector, the very sector the government should manage carefully. New immigrants are also more willing to put up with worse housing conditions and share units, pricing out locals. While the aforementioned issues are certainly alarming, there exists another contributing issue unique to Australia: negative gearing. Negative gearing was introduced in the 1930s as a way to boost the number of rental units during a housing crisis. The concept is fairly simple. Essentially, losses on a rental property can be deducted from one's personal income for tax purposes. To illustrate, let's say you earn $100,000 and have a rental property that loses $20,000 in a given year. You can then deduct this $20,000 from your income, leaving you with $80,000 of taxable income. Combine this with limited interest rate controls and other tax incentives for property owners, and you have a near-perfect environment for real estate speculation to run rampant. This heavily favors older generations who purchased property before the housing bubble, further limiting younger Australians' access to the Australian dream. There is another intangible aspect that's somewhat difficult to put a fine point on. Australians, like other Anglo nations, have a cultural aversion to complaining or being seen as whiners. Perhaps stemming from the British concept of having a stiff upper lip, indifference is now the norm when facing difficult conditions. Whereas the French burned down half of Paris when the government tried to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, Australians took a retirement age raise from 65 to 67 with hardly a peep. While this can be an admirable quality when faced with adversity, it also means Australians tend to be apathetic towards government failures. Even notoriously reserved Canada, when faced with massive government overreach during the COVID pandemic, spawned a protest movement that shut down the capital, blockaded border crossings, and forced the government to change their policy regarding mandates. However, Australia has yet to see a similar widespread protest movement. For now, it seems Australians are content with tolerating ever-worsening quality of life, ever-increasing housing costs, and the erosion of the great Australian dream for future generations. Unfortunately, it seems things in Australia are destined to get worse before they get better. Apathy and complacency have allowed things to deteriorate to this point, and without a change in the willingness of Australians to stand up and demand change, there's no reason to believe politicians will fix any of the issues facing the nation. Let's hope the prognosis is not as dire as it seems, and the great nation of Australia can reclaim its title as one of the greatest nations on Earth. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and watching one of these two videos next.